it's Leah Brick, Executive Director of SASH, and I'm here joined today with a new friend that I'm super excited to have met, Raquel Savage. We're here for another of our conversations from the couch. And today we're taking a dive into sex workers and therapists getting training specifically on working with sex workers. And for those of you that are new to us, this may not go exactly how you think it's going to go. So that's exciting to me to be offering some really great information about how you can advance yourselves in your professional lives, so that you're really offering great clinical work. So let's dig right in. Raquel, tell us about yourself.
I am Raquel Savage. I use she and her pronouns. I am a therapist, educator, and a sex worker. I work primarily with Black and Brown and queer and trans therapy clients, and most of them are sex workers as well. And we do a lot of trauma work. So I'm EMDR certified, and I'm now learning how to do somatic experiencing. So a lot of body-based trauma processing. And I've been a therapist for 5 years and informally working with clients around mental health as a coach for about 7 years. And then I've been a sex worker for 10 years. I've done full service sex work that entire time and online sex work as well. And I also do a lot of educational stuff on my website, previously through Patreon, talking about like an array of topics related to mental health and sex, sexuality, and sex work too. So both of those identities, I'd say therapy, therapist, and sex worker are two really important identities that make up a large part of my brand and everything that I do. And I think that I marry those two things really well, really beautifully.
And I think it's really important to talk about that. And I love that word, marrying them, because that is something that is so important as a clinical professional. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, about why there are some things that therapists do that are really harming and harmful. And you can really speak to that, and your program and your certification, your education programs really speak to harm that can be done. So let's start with the, why therapists should learn about working with a sex worker. And I know you're going to come from this perspective, but you're going to talk about why that language is important, and the kind of things that most therapists might say to a sex worker. So let's dig right in there. Why, well, first of all, let's say, and you're going to tell me this, that it's not learned in your graduate programs.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe something that just came to me before I even jump into all of that, just thinking about how we were talking about like marrying these two identities. I think something that comes up a lot when I talk to clinicians is something that we learned in grad school, which is we are taught to leave ourselves at the door, leave your bias at the door, like leave who you are at the door. And there's this guidance, this concept, this idea that that's even possible, and then that's something that we should go on to do, and that is what makes us professional and good therapists. And I want to challenge that pretty explicitly and say that all of the parts of who you are ought to show up in a therapy room and inform who you are as a therapist. And I think the skill here is not to allow who you are to disrupt the therapeutic process. However, and who you are can aid the therapeutic process, right? And so, for example, my entire lens of being anti-oppressive, of talking to people about patriarchy, about unpacking misogyny, about sex and sexuality, all these things that are important to me as a person and have shown up in my personal life, show up in my therapy spaces as well. And this doesn't look like me taking up space talking about things that are important to me. And it doesn't look like crossing inappropriate boundaries or lines because I'm a sex worker or I'm a sexual person. It means that my clients typically come to me because they know I'm a sex worker, and because they know that when they come to me, whether or not they're a sex worker, they can talk about sex and sexuality openly and without shame and judgment. And they know that when they come to me, because I have that lens, that they can say something and I might challenge it, and that will be therapeutic for them. So for instance, even something not even related to sex, fat phobia. I have lots of clients who come in who are like, I want to go on a diet. I need to lose weight. I have had a difficult relationship with food my entire life. And I don't say to them, you should diet or you shouldn't diet. I say, maybe we should talk about fat phobia and the ways that that impacts how we experience our bodies. Maybe we should talk about the diet industry and how that makes everyone feel a particular kind of way. I wonder how that information just impacts you and how it may shift or not shift how you feel, right? And so that's me bringing into a session who I am and what's important to me without it being like my way or the highway. So yeah, I think the first thing that just came to me was people immediately thinking about identities as counterproductive to therapeutic space. And especially when they hear sex worker identity, they're like, oh my gosh, you must have sex with your clients or, something. And so I just wanted to name early that like all the parts of your identities are important to you as a therapist and how you show up with your clients. And the same goes for me as well. So maybe I can pause there and then get into your original question.
And I love that so much that you're saying that, to bring that in. I was a therapist, I was a new therapist a long time ago. This is like, back in the 80s, back when dinosaurs still walked the earth. And things were a lot different then. But of course, I heard and I was an undergraduate. I didn't even go on to a master's degree because counseling was not my forte. I was much better in other areas. But I remember in my counseling classes, them talking about, if something that your client says brings tears to you, like you're not to show that emotion. And it was so foreign to me because I'm like, but I'm a feeling human being. How can I not hear somebody talking about the abuse that they suffered and just, stone cold?
The things that we learn in our graduate programs or the things that we do not learn really show me and it becomes clear to me why so many people have bad experiences with therapy. Because yeah, even that, what feels like the most important part of a therapeutic relationship to me is that you are able to co-regulate with your client, that you are able to sit across from this other human and you can, and I don't mean like say, I'm a safe person. I mean, you can, with your nervous system, relax enough to be in the space and have this harmonious kind of reciprocal somatic body experience to show them what it's like to be safe with another human. And that means experiencing emotions with your clients. And again, the discernment piece continuously is not in a disruptive way. So not in a way where I'm going to start crying and I'm going to be like, oh my God, I thought of this and I'm thinking about it. No, it's just like, you are allowed to emote because you are also modeling having emotion. Like a lot of our clients come in and they hold their tears back. So if we're doing the same thing, what are we even teaching our clients? So yeah, that it's, I talked to a group of counseling students a couple of weeks ago, and I said to them, like, challenge everything that you learn in your graduate program, because honestly, a lot of it is bullshit. And again, there are a lot of gaps, like a lot of the things that you end up doing or things that end up being important with your clients, you don't learn. And so sorry to all of the clients who have had therapists who sit across from them and are just a blank slate robot, right? Like, you deserve to have a client who models for you what it's like to be safe with humans.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that for just a second, about the graduate programs. And because obviously what's happening now, and it's fantastic that it's happening, is folks are getting educated on working with LGBTQIA. They're getting educated on working with BIPOC populations, that whole intersectionality. But sex work is still that taboo kind of,
Yeah.
we're not going there. Let's not talk about that.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because even like the basis of what we are prioritizing is like typically reduced to one class. So like in my graduate program, for instance, we didn't learn about LGBT and Black folks or Indigenous folks until we were in the multicultural class. Like it was like, this is the class where we're going to try to go over all of the different identities. Hope this is helpful, right? And so it's already like silly because all of the courses are just structured around essentially the what we have learned from white cis men throughout history, all of the psych people throughout history. And then that's like the client base that we're most focused on, at minimum white folks, at minimum cis folks, at minimum classed folks. And then, yeah, in the multicultural class, it's like, oh, also here's this whole other world of people. And so it already makes it difficult because we're trying to condense all of these really beautiful identities into one course. And so of course we can't go over everyone. And the thing that I think is most interesting or important about sex workers is sex work like transcends gender, race, all of the things. Anyone can be a sex worker. And you don't always know, right? So like, you don't know, you likely have had sex workers who have been your clients. If you say, I've never had a sex worker as a client, what that tells me is that you likely didn't make it safe enough for them to disclose that information. And that's really the point, is you never know when a sex worker is going to come into your office. You're never going to know when someone has exchanged or traded sex for housing money or something else and doesn't even consider themselves a sex worker. You will not know that unless you explicitly ask or explicitly make it safe for them to disclose. And so it's really unfortunate that sex work is not talked about at all. I know in my program, we didn't talk about sex work, but we did talk about trafficking. And we talked about trafficking in a way that was really harmful because it conflated sex work and trafficking. So the conversation specifically was about how porn leads to trafficking and how prostitution should be criminalized because it leads to trafficking. And these are all incorrect and horrifically harmful beliefs and whorephobic beliefs. And that's what people learned. Like the 2 seconds that we did talk about, and we didn't talk about sex work, but the 2 seconds that we talked about trafficking, we got a little bit about sex work, but it was smushed into this, it's all bad. And then it kind of goes into this, the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, where it's like a small, beautiful white child is going to get like trafficked to Russia and become a sex slave. Like that's the version that we talked about. And again, it was like for like 3 seconds. So that's all that the clinicians like in my class got. And it's bad.
One of the really like such a challenge in the sexual health industry, in the sexual health world, is those two so polar opposite ends that there's no really such a small area of gray. There's either porn is bad, porn should be abolished, porn needs to go away, and then there's the porn is not bad, sex work is not bad, everyone should accept this, and there's no place. And I am really proud of SASH, to be honest, about opening these doors for discussion and saying, gosh, let's be the place where we are having these conversations that are hard, and helping people to learn that you don't have to be on polar ends, that there is a place where there can be some common ground, and really learn language and how to be accepting, to appreciate that there are there is a place to have that conversation. I mean, it wasn't until you were talking about the language in doing this one class, and the one class is where we're talking about all of these things, and that's all smushed into one class. And it wasn't until I started having some conversations, reading some books, and really listening, that I understood, how are we bringing diversity? How are we bringing different language, SASH, I'm talking about SASH, in our presentations? How are we making sure that we can't necessarily always cover every single culture, but how are we making sure that it is not just a presentation that is focused on cisgender, heterosexual couples, white? Like,
Yeah,
how is our language
yeah,
in our presentations? What are we asking our presenters to do to
yeah.
make sure that we are being open
Mhm.
to to other groups?
Yeah, and the thing is, like, even my graduate school right now, they're doing this big thing about like decolonizing the curriculum, which is like the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Because if you're decolonizing the curriculum, then you're going to make the school free, and you won't make anybody pay to access the information. So let's not even position it as decolonizing. But they're doing this process while having majority white women and men staff, and so it's like, and with still pretty rigid ideology about how to change the curriculum. So it's like, well, we can do a little bit of this, but this is too far. And it's like, okay, so you're not decolonizing anything, for sure not. But like, even the shifts are not really happening. And so I really, when I think about that, and even like as I have gone around to talk to people about the equitable care certification, I have wanted to teach a course in a college setting about sex work. And the only people that I have met who successfully are teaching courses about sex work are 3 white women who are not sex workers. And so whenever I talk to people about like me teaching it, the barrier is I'm a queer Black woman and I am a sex worker. Like, that makes me not palatable. And so the thing about like shifting curriculum or shifting spaces to be more inclusive is that they have to inherently already be inclusive. They can't be
Right.
inclusive if they're still being taught by a bunch of white women and
Right.
or the process of shifting the curriculum is overseen by a rigid, strict white man. Like, that's just not happening. So it means having the table be full of all kinds of identities, because by proxy of that, things will change. We're here now. We're going to talk about these things. So
Right.
yeah, it's unfortunate how little like people, counselors, social workers learn in their graduate programs, and then they are in front of clients. And specific to like sex workers, they end up doing a lot of harm based on the little knowledge that they have, plus the biases that they hold.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's, let's go there. Let's talk about those biases and why it's important that somebody has the education on and the language to work with somebody who's a sex worker. Why is that? I mean, obviously we've been talking about it, but let's really lay it out there. Why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, if just from a like human perspective, if our desire is to make spaces safe and welcoming, and if our clinical desire is to do no harm, that means at minimum that we have to acknowledge and unpack our like negative bias, and acknowledge that we don't know anything, we don't have the competency around this particular community, and then be willing to do the work to learn. And so when we don't do those things, which most clinicians do not, right, we end up having therapists who are in spaces with people. And this impacts not just sex workers, it impacts anyone who's potentially talking about sex generally. And that's the thing that I feel like is also important, is like, when I say it's important to know about sex workers, I'm not saying that the only people that's benefiting is sex workers. It'll benefit all of your clients for you to comprehensively unpack your misogyny or your purity culture or all of the things. But specific to sex workers, I mean, we have clinicians who are conflating sex work and trafficking. So we have, I'll use myself as an example. I've had my therapist for like 5 years now, and she's incredible. And I don't really think that she knows that much about sex work, but she is someone who defers to me. So I come in and I talk about like, oh yeah, I do sex work and also I do this and da, 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 da. And she's like, well, what do you want to talk about? And then I want to talk about my mommy and daddy problems. I don't want to talk about sex work. I don't have any problems with my sex work. But clinicians do this thing where they conflate sex work and trafficking or sex work and exploitation or a number of other things that I'm going to talk about. And so then they want to go straight to that. Well, let's talk about this, the trading sex. That must be really problematic. That must be really harmful for you. Or they go into assumptions about childhood sexual abuse or trauma, or they go into assumptions about substance use, like by proxy of you being a sex worker, you must use drugs. By proxy of you being a sex worker, you must have been molested as a child. And clinicians, because of their bias, end up doing higher and more intense diagnosing, and their treatment plans look different for clients who are sex workers versus clients who are not, which impacts sex workers directly if they have a diagnosis that is, and more intense, I'm like using relatively here, but differently, right? And they are more likely to report or use interventions that are going to be harmful for sex workers and their families. And generally, I think the most probably common thing is just having a negative bias, which shows up on their body, their facial expressions, their body language, which makes clients feel unsafe in session. And then, yeah, making assumptions about what the presenting concern is. So as opposed to going to whatever the client wants to talk about, making an assumption that, well, the problem must be sex work. So there's like so many different things, really. And all of them are really fucking harmful.
The one thing that you didn't mention when you were talking about like all of the biases and stuff, and the thing that came to my mind is relationships. Well, obviously you can't have any
Yeah.
meaningful relationship if you're a sex worker, and so dealing with that. I know that ASECT, and certainly we do with our credential program, we require a SARS, and I'm wondering if you know of any SARS that include biases or discussions around sex work.
So the only thing that I know that is doing any kind of like clinical work to educate sex workers or to educate clinicians about sex workers would be individual sex workers who are going to talk to clinicians. So me and my business partner, Angie Gunn, Jasmine, Jet Setting Jasmine is also a clinician and a sex worker. So there's like a handful of us who are kind of doing this work. I know about, I think that Dr. Sprankle he definitely does work and research around this. I don't know how much like trainings or if there's any SARS, but separate from those, it's the equitable care certification. So that's the certification that Angie Gunn and I are working on. It's a 12-week course that goes over a lot of different topics related to sex work, and some not. Some are just filling the gaps from what you missed during your graduate program, right? Like trauma, for instance. That are explicitly training clinicians to work with sex workers as therapy clients. So I don't even want to say that they're like limited, because I know that there are people out there doing this work, and I feel like I know a lot of them, but they're mostly individual clinicians or clinicians/sex workers who are attempting to really fill this gap.
So we've been saying the term a lot, and I think we really need to spend a minute defining sex work, because I can imagine that there are just a bunch of people watching this thinking, well, it's only this and not this, and so let's define that word. And you said the word porophobia, and I think we need to dig into that for a few minutes too.
Sure. So sex work is an umbrella term for anyone in the sex industry, and that includes sugar babies, phone sex workers, OnlyFans models, porn performers, full service sex workers, doms, strippers. So anyone in the sex industry, it's just a big umbrella term. And just speaking about language really quick, when we're talking about full service workers, this is the correct way to say prostitutes. People who are sex workers and prostitutes are totally entitled to use that language. I, for instance, love calling myself a prostitute. I am a prostitute. I love calling myself a hooker and a whore. And these are words that have been used in harmful ways and have negative connotations from people who are not sex workers. So it's not appropriate for you, if you are not a prostitute, to use that word. Instead, you can say full service sex workers. And if you're talking about someone who works on the street, you can say street-based full-service sex workers. So it is an umbrella term for many, many different things, and it's often used to unite sex workers and be used as an identity marker. So sex work is, for lots of folks, considered part of their identity or one of their many identities. And that term was also coined by Carol Leigh, who passed away, I think it was last year. She was a sex worker and an activist. So yeah, it's like an umbrella term, a catch-all term for all of the different jobs.
How do you get around people who say that's illegal? It is, you're selling your body for money, and that, how do you help people with that?
It really depends on the context. I am typically not someone who does the, how would I like to put this? I do not care to or desire to talk to people who are invested in their belief system and believe that they are right and are not interested in learning more. So if someone like replies to my comment on Twitter or approaches me at a panel or something and they're like, well, this is illegal and it's wrong and it's disgusting and it's immoral, I say, have a nice day. Like, I just don't even engage it, because that's not my ministry personally. I know that there are folks who like doing that kind of work. For me, it's not. I like to talk to folks who have whatever their experiences or beliefs are previously and are interested in shifting them, or are interested in interrogating them or questioning them, because that's the entry point for actual, like, genuine and sincere and meaningful conversation. So really the first thing is I just assess where they're at. And then second to that, I mostly just ask questions and try to plant seeds. I don't try to get to like from 0 to 100 in one conversation. I mean, if someone came up to me and said, well, that's illegal, I might say, that's really interesting. Laws are a social construct, and laws disproportionately affect certain people. I wonder what you think about that. And what does it mean to you to be a law-abiding citizen? Is that something that's important to you? And those are just questions. I'm not going to say laws are bad or laws are good or whatever. I'm just thinking, let's unpack that some, because who gives a fuck if it's illegal is my real opinion. But if I respond in that way, that's not really productive to the conversation. So I mostly ask people questions and see and like do just some like poking and like, yeah, seed planting, because then they leave that conversation and they're like, I never thought about that. Wait, hold on. Let me think more about this. Let me read more about this. And then that's kind of what leads them to their own research process.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, I love that, because that really, as you said, it opens the door for the conversation.
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm coming at you and I'm just saying you can't do this, this is why you can't do that, it's illegal, and I'm holding that firm line, and you're coming back at me from a defensive posture, then everybody loses.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily about winning or losing, but how are we going to have the conversation if we don't allow ourselves to walk in and open our minds a little bit?
Absolutely. And I think with clinicians who are supposed to be people who are like doing similar work as they're asking their clients to do, it's also fun and interesting to ask folks like, what comes up for you? Like, what's there for you? What happens in your body when I say this certain thing? Is there a particular sensation? And what do you associate that with? And what are the messages and the meanings that come up? And what memories do you have from your past? Is there a time that blah, 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 blah? And like, when did you first learn? Because so often it's also connected to our own personal experiences, right? Like, I know, especially like with a lot of, I mean, and again, I don't work so much with cishet men, but like with women clinicians, a lot of it also comes from their own experiences of being slut shamed, of being taught about how they are supposed to relate to their own bodies and their own sexualities. And so they have decided that because they have this piece of trauma in their own life, that the way to best navigate that is to kind of double down on their own shame and shaming other people. So yeah, I honestly approach a lot of these conversations from the perspective of like questioning and curiosity, rather than let me tell you what the truth is. Because again, when people are able to do their own reflection process, then they get more curious about researching on their own and challenging their own beliefs on their own. And people typically do. I mean, I see people leave any of the trainings that I've done with just like wide eyes, like, I never thought about half of the shit you just said today. And I love it, because that stays with them more than me just like talking at them with my own belief system. Because you're right, it's not about win or lose, but it definitely is a lose-lose. If you're yelling and dysregulated and I'm yelling and dysregulated, we're gonna get nowhere with that. So yeah.
So you brought up some some um some things around like how the system's broken, and that there really are some
Oh,
things.
did you want me to define whorephobia? I forgot. I didn't get.
Yes,
I can do
let's
that
go
too.
there first.
Yeah. So um I hope folks have some analysis or lens on systems of oppression, and that there are many different systems of oppression, and for each system there is a word that describes it, right? Homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and all of the isms and phobias, and that all of those things have a particular history that aligns with it. So transphobia is the history of trans people or gender nonconforming people experiencing unjust, prolonged treatment because of their gender identity, right? And that there is language, derogatory language that goes along with it. So there are slurs typically, right? And so those are all the things that kind of inform a system of oppression. Similarly, for sex workers, there is whorephobia, which is a fun and cute word, and I love it so much. And it represents the history of violent, unfair, criminalized treatment towards sex workers, and acknowledges that there is a system that exists that has and still exists that has done that, and language. We talked a little bit about language earlier that upholds it, right? There are words that allow you to enact whorephobia and say like you are less than, you are inferior. So whorephobia broadly is the hatred of, the oppression of, the violence towards, the discrimination against sex workers, and by extension, the disgust towards activities or attire related to sex work, right? So just how I talked about earlier, when you learn about these things, yes, they benefit your sex worker clients and they benefit everyone, because any of these systems, while they directly impact the people who occupy the identities, they also, the ripple effect is impacting others, right? So with whorephobia specifically, we can see easily how the criminalization of full service sex work, right, can very negatively impact a sex worker's life. And by extension, it's like people who do or any kind of other, like writing erotica or working at being a clinician who's kink friendly, and kind of these ripple effects to other people who either support or occupy space that feels adjacent.
It makes me think of some of the gender, like the gender work that is being done around gender rules, gender roles, and a woman who is promiscuous is a whore, a
Yeah,
slut.
that's whorephobia.
Mhm.
Quite literally, yeah, like white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, purity culture, whorephobia, all of those things are really bundled together in many ways. And so, yeah, when we think of like, if we get down to the root of any one of these kinds of examples of shaming, so I'm thinking about like the little girls at purity balls with their dads, or yeah, talking about losing your virginity and like you should not have sex, you're this, or any of these things really can get down to this root, which is don't be a whore.
Mhm.
Don't be a whore.
Right.
That is the root of it. And that is quite literally whorephobia, because the worst case scenario is this person or my daughter or whatever is going to be a whore. They're going to be a stripper. They're going to be a full service worker. They're going to be a street-based worker. That's the worst case scenario in people's minds. Again, it goes down to don't be a whore. And it's not always that explicit, right? But sometimes it is. Like I remember being slut shamed in like high school, and it was about that. Like you're a whore,
Right.
you're a whore, you're a
Yeah.
whore. So
I,
yeah.
I'm a huge Ted Lasso fan, for those of you that out there that are Ted Lasso fans. And there was a show, one of the episodes was around that one of the characters who had sent a sex video of her masturbating to her lover, and her current partner that she was in a relationship with wanted her to put out an apology
Mm,
on her socials, and she said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not putting out an apology. I'm not embarrassed about what I did. It's not porn. And like, you're going to need to accept the fact that this happened, and I'm not ashamed.
mm, yeah.
It was a big deal.
And I would say that that works towards kind of disrupting whorephobia. And if part of the sentiment that that character said was like, it's not porn, that's also enacting whorephobia, right? So it sounds like there's duality there. There is like, I am not ashamed of my sexuality. I'm not ashamed that I put it on video, which is like the disruption. And then saying it's not porn is the whorephobia, in part because it's saying, well, if it was porn, then I maybe would be embarrassed. So that's like it sounds like a dual kind of experience
Yeah.
here,
Well,
like
and
disrupting
she didn't say it. It was her partner said, what, like, you've got porn on the internet. And and the character was like,
yeah.
no,
Uh-huh.
like, I'm not ashamed. I'm not apologizing. It's not porn. And I mean, I'm interpreting that. But then she went on to say, to one of her best friends, her friend said, how can I help? And she said, can you, you know, help to change society so that women are not over sexualized and then shamed and ridiculed for being sexual? She's like,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm on it.
I love that.
It was really great. It was very moving. So,
Yeah.
well, so you talked about adjacent people who are in adjacent professions being impacted, but
Mhm.
what let's talk for a minute about the mandated reporting and the laws, because you mentioned that, are you people saying, you're breaking the law and that kind of stuff. Let's talk about those systems.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so much that could be said. I think that it's like hard for me to distill into like a short brief, but maybe what I will say is along with the questioning of all of these other things that like people have learned in their programs or beliefs that they have been firm in because they were taught that that's the right thing for many years, that beginning to question the ways that therapists and the mental health field uphold systems of oppression, including allegiance with the state being police, prisons, is really important because not only is it negatively impacting sex workers, it is negatively impacting a lot of different people and disproportionately impacting Black and Brown families. So practices like mandated reporting when it comes to CPS and families disproportionately impacts Black and Brown families, whether that's sex worker families or not. In terms of who is more likely to be reported, who is more likely to have their child removed. And then people kind of go into this, well, they go into the binary thinking that we talked about earlier is really, really kind of prevalent in these conversations. Well, what if a father is sexually abusing, you're saying that, and it's like, let's take a breath. Most often, that's actually not what's happening, right? Most often, these CPS reports are around poverty. The kid's not being fed, the kid's not being bathed, the kid's not being taken care of in a particular way. And the intervention is not to remove the child. The intervention is to figure out how we can get funds to poor families. And when we're thinking about situations where there is abuse in the home or sexual abuse in the home, by saying that the best intervention is sending them to foster care, where we know that they are more likely to be abused and harmed, is not an intervention. And if the only thing that we can do, the only alternative to leaving a child in an abusive situation is taking them to another one, what are we doing? Again, interventions can be working with the family, finding out safe people that they can be within their community, not removing them from them. So yeah, thinking about how as therapists we uphold these really harmful systems and who they disproportionately impact, and other kinds of practices like involuntarily hospitalizing people, which is extremely traumatizing, or things like using the police for wellness checks. I mean, there are just so many ways that therapists are agents of the state. And so, yeah, thinking through what comes up for you when I even say any of those things, how you have interacted with some of those systems and how you have potentially done harm, and holding space for what comes up for you when you acknowledge that you have done harm. And then beginning to try to be curious to figure out alternatives, right? Like how can we work with families where they are experiencing poverty and aren't able to feed their kids, or where there is abuse happening and we understand that alternatives to removing them may be better than putting them in a foster care system where they're going to be explicitly removed and separated from their families, and will experience harm and abuse, more likely to experience harm and abuse as well. So yeah, becoming curious around how we can disrupt and build new practices.
It really makes me think of there's so many different sayings, but be the change you want to see in the world,
Mhm.
and when I hear you talk about changing these systems, that it's like that is this giant, like giant problem. And how do you crack this nut, man, as
Yeah.
one little person trying to crack this nut? And how do we do it? We do it by doing exactly what you and I are doing today, which is
Yeah.
having a conversation, starting a conversation to get people to think about what are the words you're using, how are you causing harm, how do I need to open my own mind to um, seeing things a little bit differently. And maybe that doesn't mean I agree wholeheartedly and I go, we're talking about the poles, and I go from over here to over here, but maybe I shift just a little bit of what I'm doing, and as you said, become curious and not judgmental
Yeah.
about it. I love that. We've got, whew, man, we talked about a lot of stuff. So many things. And I want to close our little segment today with talking about the webinar that you're going to be doing for SASH. So that is on August 25th. And I am embarrassed to say that I don't have the title of it right off the top of my head. Maybe you remember the exact title.
I don't, but I'm sure that it's like working with sex workers 101, something like that.
It is something like that. And the exact title is really irrelevant. What is most important is that Raquel is going to be talking about how to learn more about working with sex workers, how defining this language, and really beginning that conversation and getting you to think about why you haven't done this work before and how you can bring it into your own practice. So August 25th, 1 to 2:30, hour and a half. It is yourself and one of your partners, correct?
Yeah, my business partner, Angie Gunn.
So she will be joining us, and you can use all of this, the credits for that for the SASH credentials. So we really strongly encourage that. And let's also tell people where they can go for more learning in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so we're going to be doing like a 101 essentially for SASH. And then if you are interested, if you become curious and want to learn more, we do have a full certification called the Equitable Care Certification. You can find it online, Equitable Care Cert, CRT, just for short.com. And we have a full 12-week training course where you're going to learn everything about sex workers, the history of sex work, systems of oppression, trauma, abuse, conflation of sex work and trafficking, porn and parenting, or just how sex workers are parents and how those identities overlap, the role of community there. I mean, there's so much that we go through in those 12 weeks. And then you'll be given a sex worker client to work with directly, so that you can essentially flex your big skills that you learned. And then you'll be able to get the certification and you'll officially be an ECC certified clinician. And that will be great because sex workers who are looking for clinicians who understand who they are and will be able to offer affirming care. You'll have that like right on your website. So
That's
we're really
amazing.
excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. It's been just a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate you and your time and the work that you're doing. And I look forward to having your webinar as part of our SASH learning. So thank you so much, Raquel.
You.